I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on contested lands of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, pay our respects to elders past, present and becoming, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands, waterways and skies of this unceded land that has a very, very long tradition of education and learning. We're here to talk about exams. Now, exams are probably one of the most contentious topics in higher education teaching and learning. They've been heralded as our saviour for addressing everything from emergency remote teaching to generative artificial intelligence to contract cheating. Exams are the panacea that's going to solve it all. And I can't say that's the CRADLE view of things. I'm painting a bit of a caricature, but those sort of views are out there in the literature and in practice in some corners. And something that came along that really shook things up was a particular paper, which was led by two of our presenters today, Dr. Sarah French and Professor Raoul Mulder, who are both from the University of Melbourne, Faculty of Education in different parts of the faculty. And this paper that they published in 2014 or very, very late 2023 has risen to become in the top 5% altmetrics papers of all time. It has more than 13,000 reads. And I just love this paper because it challenges some taken for granted assumptions about what exams are good for and what they do. So today we're going to get to hear from Sarah and Raoul. They're going to talk for the first part of our time together, and then we're going to have time for Q&A, and we'll finish on the hour. So we'll finish at 3, and then we'll have time for just a little bit more talk and Q&A and cake outside for our in-person guests. And those of you who are online, we haven't arranged the virtual cake, but we tried. It's on the R&D agenda for CRADLE. But yeah, so that's our plan. This talk is recorded, so if you say anything in person in the Q&A here or type a question into chat, it may end up as part of our recording. If you want to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A function if you're on Zoom, or if you're in person at the end, you'll get a chance to raise your hand and ask your question. Please do use the chat if you are online, but note that we will not be funneling questions from the chat into the Q&A. With that Q&A, go in and upvote your favourite questions so that we know which ones people really would love to see addressed. And we don't circulate the chat typings in general, but we do go in, and if there's any particularly useful links, we sometimes circulate those at the end. I'm looking to my CRADLE colleagues. We've covered off on the core stuff. We can get going on the good things. All right, fantastic. A big in-person and virtual welcome round of applause for Raoul and Sarah. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Phil, for that very warm welcome. And I also would like to, before we speak, just acknowledge that the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we carried out this work, on which we're meeting today, are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And also just to extend a big thank you to the CRADLE team for the opportunity to come and discuss this. We're really excited about the opportunity to talk about this topic. These 3 words, as Phil has indicated, have an incredible capacity to evoke very strong and often polarized reactions. And to illustrate that, I just want to show you a little word cloud that we ran with some of our colleagues recently, where we just asked them, what one word is it that you associate with high stakes examinations? And you can sort of see what sort of themes dominate here. And a lot of those are words that don't have particularly positive connotations. So there's stress, we've got anxiety, pressure, cramming, inauthentic, invalid, and the quite evocative and all-encompassing yuck. But on the other hand, we also have terms in this word cloud like reliable and accurate and integrity. So this is just a snapshot of some of the feelings people have about high stakes exams. And this is by no means a full list of all of the themes that have come up. And I think it's particularly interesting that the one word that doesn't come up anywhere in this word cloud is learning. So this is a debate that is mirrored in the media, quite a lot of passionate advocacy for exams as well as against exams. And just give you a bit of background about how this paper came about. Sarah and I have spent a number of years working together in an academic team that supports academic staff from across the University of Melbourne to try and achieve changes and uplift, as it's colloquially known, in terms of curriculum change. And obviously, when we were having these conversations, assessment reform was a frequent topic of discussion. And so we spent a lot of time talking about assessment reform and, of course, examinations. And the one thing that really struck us was how the sorts of perspectives that we've illustrated here were mirrored in the claims and the very strongly held beliefs that academics that we work with were sharing with us about examinations. What was unclear to us was how often those views and opinions were actually backed up by evidence. And we were a little bit surprised that when we started delving into the literature, that for a topic as contentious as this, we couldn't really find a review that visited all of these themes that repeatedly surfaced and tried to work out whether they were backed up by empirical evidence. So that basically, in a nutshell, is what we said to do. Now, we don't think by any means this is going to be the last word on this topic, but we do hope that in terms of identifying and critically examining some of these arguments, we can provide others with the sort of resource that we found a little bit lacking when we were having these conversations, struggling to find. We also felt, as Phil has indicated too, that a review of this kind would be timely, because even though questions around the pedagogical value of exams have been around for a very, very long time, and historically there will always be very strong economic incentives for institutions to use high-stakes exams. There's no doubt that they're very resource-efficient forms of assessment. More recently, there's a real sense of renewed enthusiasm for high-stakes exams, and that's largely due to the emergence of generative AI and a sort of a widespread perception that maybe these are uniquely secure ways of assessing what a student understands without access to Gen AI tools.
So the paper that resulted from our review has just appeared in the current issue of Higher Education. It's open access and available via the link there, and hopefully someone can put that in the chat for you. We've also written an occasional paper for the Centre for the Study of Higher Education, which is intended more as a practical guide and which considers alternatives to exams as well. We also published a short piece in The Conversation to provide a more accessible entry to the paper. So in the seminar today, what we'd like to do is first provide a bit of background on the scope of the review and the key questions that we sought to address, outline what we know about good assessment practice, and to visit the 7 key themes that emerged from our review of the literature. We'll finish by talking about some alternatives to high-stakes exams in terms of assessment. And because this is a collaborative endeavour, we're going to share the presenting hopefully quite fluidly between the two of us. So our review focused on exams because even though there are many assessments that can be described as high stakes, and even though since the 1970s there's been a shift away from high stakes final examinations in many countries, they do remain the dominant form of summative assessment at many institutions, including our own. Now, it's easy to get caught up in a definitional quagmire around high stakes exams because exams, of course, can take on many forms. They also have varied weightings. But for the purposes of this review, we were most interested in traditional closed book invigilated exams. So exams that are in written format, that are highly consequential and heavily weighted, high pressure, time and information constrained, one chance assessments that don't provide students with any opportunity to improve, reflect, or obtain and implement feedback.
Now, for those of you who are thinking, surely that isn't really a very common form of assessment at universities anymore, let me offer you a snapshot of assessment modalities at a typical large metropolitan university. This university offers about 6,000 subjects for undergraduate and postgraduate level, and there are over 22,000 assessments associated with those subjects. But when you look at this table, really what you see is quite clearly is that most subjects have high-stakes assessments. Most high-stakes assessments are exams, and high-stakes exams are typically quite heavily weighted, around about 60 to 68%. Interestingly enough, there's also quite a lot of variation, disciplinary diversity in terms of how prominently high-stakes exams feature in the assessment regime. So these 10 panels here summarize the use of high-stakes exams in assessment across 10 different faculties, same university. On the x-axis here, we've got the weighting of the examination from 0 through to 100%. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the frequency. That's been standardized so that all of these graphs have the same axes. And these red lines in the facet plots here show the mean weighting across all exams in that academic division. And there are a number of things that really emerge from this figure that I think are interesting. First of all, the prevalence of exams varies quite a lot. So in some faculties like H, they've more or less disappeared, or perhaps they were never that prominent in the first place. Whereas in other faculties like C, they are the dominant mode of assessment. But really, they feature pretty prominently across all of these disciplines. And at this institution, there are well over 2,000 high-stakes examinations that are administered overall. The second thing I think that's interesting is that the distribution of the weightings varies, again, across academic disciplines. In some discipline areas, like Faculty B here, they are skewed left, and the mean weighting of the examinations is around 35%, whereas in others like Faculty F here, the mean weighting is skewed very strongly to the right. There are still many examples of 100% weighted final examinations, admittedly as an option, and a mean weighting of almost 90% for those assessment items.
So knowing then that high-stakes exams are still widely being used across university subjects, the key question that drove our review was, is the enduring popularity of high-stakes exams justified by the empirical evidence? We started by considering what we know about good assessment practice. And here we looked at empirical studies in the field as well as scholarship on assessment in higher education. And we found that arguments about good assessment centre around three key recurring themes. So the first is validity. Assessment tasks need to be able to assess what we intend them to assess, and a student's assessment should accurately reflect their capability. It's known that there can be validity issues with a single assessment, so multiple types of assessment can better address validity. This is one reason why diversity in assessment tasks is so important, but diversity is also critical for a number of other key reasons. Firstly, all university subjects include a broad range of learning outcomes that require different assessment methods. In a standards-based assessment system such as ours, student performance is mapped to learning outcomes and their performance is measured against those outcomes. The importance of constructive alignment between learning outcomes and assessment tasks has been well established by scholars such as John Biggs and others. Yet we often see a mismatch between the stated learning objectives and assessment practices. Assessment also needs to be diversified to be able to verify a broad range of graduate attributes. This is a graduate attribute statement from a large metropolitan university, but these are quite similar, of course, across different institutions. And they highlight skills such as being self-directed, having skills in group work and self-assessment, being willing to explore, experiment and learn from mistakes. And yet we so often see assessment designs that look like this, and this does come from an actual handbook entry. So 2 short written assignments and a 70% end of semester exam are clearly not the ideal methods to measure, validate or teach the kinds of graduate attributes being promoted. A good assessment regime should also provide students with the opportunity to be able to demonstrate different skills. It's known that students perform differently on different assessment tasks, so a diversity in assessment methods allows for a more multidimensional understanding of a student's knowledge and skills. And this is important to ensure assessment design is inclusive of all students. Some assessment tasks are more readily able to engage students in deep learning and higher order thinking. Another key argument around good assessment, as David Bowd and others have argued, is that well assessments should prepare students to become lifelong learners. To fulfil this role, they need to do more than provide students with a measure of their current performance. They must also lay the foundations for future learning. So, for example, they need to be designed in such a way that students can judge the quality of their work to improve it, rather than being passive recipients of feedback. Assessment design can also be used to foster and maintain student engagement through the design of tasks that are interesting, challenging, and creative. The third reoccurring argument is that intentional planning around the timing of assessment tasks is important, and you'll be very familiar with the educational research that stresses the importance of early formative feedback to ensure that assessment is supporting student learning rather than just testing it. So feedback provided early to midway through the semester helps students to consolidate their learning, to self-assess and to build their knowledge and skills over time. Formative assessment tasks also allow teaching staff to better understand what students have learned, to identify areas of weakness and to correct them during the teaching process. On the other hand, continuous use of formative assessments can lead students to feeling over-assessed, so it is important to get that timing balance in the timing right. So considering what we know then about good assessment, we approached our scoping review with the view that there appears to be a misalignment between what we know about good assessment practice and high stakes final exams. So we did start with a view, but we wanted to look more closely at the empirical evidence to test our assumptions. Could there be a pedagogical argument in favour of the value of high stakes exams? Is there evidence to justify their continuing use in higher education? So in our analysis and synthesis of 122 papers in the educational literature on high stakes exams, we identified 7 key recurring themes, and we're going to examine each of those in some detail here. The themes are memory recall and knowledge retention, student motivation and learning, authenticity and real-world relevance, validity and reliability, academic misconduct and contract cheating, stress, anxiety and well-being, and fairness and equity. And within each theme, we examined both the perceived benefits and the drawbacks of high-stakes exams. So the first theme focuses on memory recall and knowledge retention. Studies in the field of cognitive psychology show that the testing effect, or what's known as test-enhanced learning, improves retention. But it's long been argued that such retention can be short-lived. And this is likely because the kinds of cognitive activity that are required for long-term retention are quite different to those that are required for memorising and rote learning facts. Now, of course, well-designed exams can discourage rote learning, but content analyses have been conducted that show most exams do test isolated recall of factual information. Studies on test-enhanced learning also find that the spacing, timing and frequency of effective testing is not aligned with the conditions of high-stakes exams. So regular short answer tests or quizzes taken shortly after the content is taught have been found to be far better for retention than final end-of-semester exams. Exams can also undermine long-term knowledge retention as they tend to emphasise extrinsic reward, enticing students to memorise facts so that they can perform well on an exam rather than to engage them in deeper learning or in successive relearning. So the second theme relates to student motivation and learning. One of the commonly cited benefits of exams is that they can play a role in motivating students to study. We know that studying effectively is important for learning. And unsurprisingly, studies of self-reported levels of motivation have found that students report feeling more motivated for high-stakes testing than they do for low stakes. And motivation is linked to positive outcomes in those studies. But of course, if student motivation to study is linked to a desire to rote learn in order to perform well in an exam, they're not intrinsically motivated, which we know is important for learning. Instead, exams tend to encourage strategic learning, where students focus on studying content that has the potential to enable them to gain higher grades, and on study methods like memorisation. So strategy becomes more important to students than substance. And so then practices like cramming become inevitable. This also relates to the idea of consequential validity, where what students do is a consequence of high-stakes testing. A further impediment to student learning results from the responses of teachers. So exams encourage teachers to teach to the test, and this results in curriculum narrowing, which is a perhaps inevitable outcome of high-stakes testing. Teachers naturally align the content they teach to what will or what can be assessed in the final exam.
The third theme that we explored is around authenticity and real-world relevance. Now, for some workplaces and some professions, illustrated one of those here, it could be argued that being able to recall information under time pressure without recourse to materials is essential for that profession, an essential skill. None of us wants our pilot or surgeon to be leafing through the manual in sort of a moment of crisis. But it's very, very much debatable whether or not that argument really seriously applies to the majority of profession. And even for these contexts, we have to wonder whether or not conducting those tests within the sort of artificial construct of an examination in an exam hall really tells us anything meaningful about how a particular individual or professional would react or would respond in a moment of crisis. And really one of the most enduring criticisms within the literature of high-stakes exams is their lack of authenticity. They generally do a very poor job of mimicking what we would imagine would be authentic workplace challenges, and they don't tend to foster the kinds of skills that employers tell us matter for their workplaces. So very poor job of teaching or helping students acquire skills like listening, or more generically, the ability to learn from mistakes through trial and error. Given that high-stakes exams play such a pivotal role in determining whether a student passes or fails, whether they progress, whether they're admitted to a program, whether they get certified, you'd think that, when we administer them, we have very high confidence in their validity. That is to say, they measure what they're supposed to measure. In this case, the skill that's required to be able to shoot an arrow right in the middle of that bullseye. We also want them to be reliable. So we want to have high confidence that they're consistently going to generate the same result time after time. So if we put an archer in this situation and get them to shoot at the target 100 times, then depending on their level of archery skill, we expect them to be consistently hitting that target or consistently missing the bullseye. Now, the definition I've provided up here is a very broad and oversimplification of what's actually a very complex and multifaceted construct with lots of different dimensions. But the key point that I want to make, and that sort of struck us when we went through this particular theme, is that even though there is a really well-developed literature on how you go about validating tests, which is applied extensively to prominent high-stakes instruments that are subject to a lot of public scrutiny, like medical admissions exams, etc. This is not something that we require or routinely do in the university curriculum or the university context. So examinations are typically set by disciplinary academics like me, who have lots of expertise, lots of disciplinary knowledge, but I would say scant expertise in trying to work out how to design an instrument that maximizes or evaluates or maximizes the validity of the test. I think it's also very interesting to note that in this context, university teachers and students have often very different perceptions of whether or not a particular test is valid or fair. And that has really important flow-on consequences then for how students view them and how they engage with them. In addition, we know that exams are notoriously unreliable. in terms of their ability to produce consistent, reproducible results. And there are a lot of factors that can cause inconsistency in a student's performance. It can be influenced by a student's psychological or physical health, the conditions of the examination space, or a whole range of factors that can influence the performance or the judgment of the examiner. Now, you could argue that issues of validity are not particularly unique to examinations. But nevertheless, if you combine this sort of absence of a culture of validation, the difficulty of achieving high validity across multiple dimensions, the myriad of factors that can affect the reliability of examination performance, I think there's a very sort of troubling lack of validity and reliability evidence that underpins this culture of high-stakes examinations. By far the most common argument we hear when it comes to high-stakes exams is the idea that we need exams because whatever you may say about them, they are the only way of determining with any level of confidence what a student really knows or understands when they're cut off from access to the internet, their notes, or generative AI. And I think this is also part of the rationale for applying heavy weightings to examinations, often 50% or more of the overall assessment for a particular subject. We think this argument is problematic for a few different reasons. The first is that it's not at all clear that perception that examinations represent uniquely secure forms of assessment is actually backed up by the evidence. Obviously, when students take invigilated exams in a space like this is a sort of a dystopian picture that generative AI has conjured up for me. It's a tightly controlled environment, so the students have to provide photo ID. Every move they make is potentially scrutinized. But those studies that have surveyed students and asked them about cheating suggests that if we have that confidence, it might be just a little bit misplaced. They include a study by McCabe in 2005 of over 60,000 North American students, in which over 1/3 admitted to some form of exam cheating. And of course, landmark study by Tracy Braytag and colleagues on Australian students that found that when students cheated, they did so at higher rates in exams than they did in any other form of assessment. And arguably, this makes sense, right? The higher the stakes, presumably, the greater potential benefit from cheating and the higher the motivation to cheat. But it led Braytag and colleagues to conclude that examinations provide universities and accrediting bodies probably with a false sense of security. Now, why are even these contexts where we administer very tightly controlled environments not necessarily secure? Well, there are a range of reasons. Some relate to lax practice, and Phil and others have sort of highlighted issues like the same exam, which is potentially out in the public domain, being reused, conducting exams in uncontrolled environments online, having rules that are really not enforceable in terms of security, and low-level, one-right type of answer tests. But even in invigilated exams, students can get around the constraints of an in-person invigilated exams. This was an SBS story that aired a few years ago, which claimed to provide evidence for a thriving cottage industry around impersonation of students and falsification of photo IDs. Now, the research evidence suggests that the frequency at which this happens is probably relatively low, but I suspect that we don't really have any reliable idea of how common this is. And I was struck when I recently went to start an exam at the University of Melbourne, how we have this combined problem now, declining attendance at lectures, and how that means that individual teachers know less and less about the students that are in their class. So when I went to this exam, there were many, many students that I had never seen before who had presumably not been to class, and I honestly could not tell you whether or not they were enrolled in my subject or not. The second deeper issue, I think, when it comes to this sort of problem of exam security relates to the mindset that informs it. And I guess I would characterize it as a mindset that believes that assessment security effectively trumps every other aspect of assessment design. Now, obviously, any assessment that we design involves some kind of trade-off. But the argument here seems to be that even if an assessment is heavily compromised in all sorts of ways, at least it's secure. In other words, unless the assessment is secure, it's pointless. Now, that feels like a Pyrrhic victory to me. And another way of thinking about it, I think, is that if an assessment isn't valid as a measure of what students have learned, it doesn't matter how secure it is. It's equally pointless.
The next theme highlights that high-stakes exams impact negatively on student wellbeing. This issue is the focus of much recent scholarship on higher education that points to the role that curriculum and assessment play in supporting student mental health and wellbeing. However, the known negative impacts of exams on student mental health is not new. In fact, it dates back to when exams were first used in imperial China, when cases of mental disorder were anecdotally attributed to the failing of high-stakes exams. These were the high-pressured exams that students had to sit to enter the civil service. So this has been an issue since their inception. There's some debate regarding whether anxiety impacts negatively on performance. There are even some that suggest that exam anxiety promotes study. And so there's an argument that anxiety can be a good thing. But I think this would need to be, carefully weighed against the adverse effects on student mental health and wellbeing. And these are really demonstrated extensively in the literature. In fact, this was one area where we found a very large number of studies. So studies show unequivocally that stress is elevated during exams. Students also report high levels of anxiety during exam periods. The negative health impacts reported are extensive. They're linked to lower concentration, lower self-confidence, less sleep, lower motivation, and impaired memory. And these, of course, are all likely to have a negative impact on student performance and achievement. There's also evidence that anxiety drives students to adopt surface approaches to learning. It's likely that higher weighted exams have stronger negative impacts on student wellbeing due to their increased concerns about the consequences of the outcomes. We also know that stress affects students unequally, which leads to our final theme. And the final theme relates to whether exams are a fair and equitable form of assessment. Some assume they are, that they allow students to compete on equal footing, but the evidence really doesn't back up this view. Firstly, we know that students perform differently under time pressure, which has implications for how fair an exam is. Closed book exams advantage those who can memorise and recall information quickly, those who are good at written tasks, those who can concentrate and focus immediately. And of course, exams might be unfair if some students succeed in cheating and others don't. There's also considerable evidence that exams generate academic inequity and that they disadvantage marginalised groups. It's worth noting that this is an issue even prior to university, since those who are trained in high school to sit exams are more likely to be admitted in the first place. So it could be argued that there's an issue of elitism attached to exams right from the beginning. There are many studies that suggest there's a gender bias, including one that shows women underperform on exams while they outperform on other modes of assessment. But those findings aren't unanimous, and there is probably some debate about whether different genders can be said to perform differently in exams. What I do find more compelling, though, is the argument that exams might disadvantage students from ethnic minorities and that they have a bias towards Western students. There's quite extensive literature suggesting that exams promote Western intellectual knowledge and values. They generally test Western knowledge in a linear manner and, of course, in a written format. Many argue that they disadvantage Indigenous students, and those observations also have implications for international students from non-Western countries. Research also argues that exams fail to meet the needs of student diversity, particularly in respect to students with disabilities. And we know that the kinds of extra measures that we have in place to address disadvantage, such as giving students more time, are really inadequate to address those needs. So ultimately, as scholarship on inclusive assessment design has argued, inclusive assessment design needs to move beyond a consideration of particular equity groups or categories of students to ensure that assessment practices don't disadvantage diverse students.
So those are the themes that we explored. And look, the conclusion we've arrived at after exploring all of those themes is that overwhelmingly, the drawbacks of high-stakes exams outweigh their benefits, and that overall there's surprisingly little pedagogical evidence to justify this incredibly widespread use of high-stakes exams in university curricula. And that suggests that really the main reason we hold on to them is they're very resource efficient to deliver and to mark. And I'm not denying for a moment the reality of resource challenges. They're a real inescapable part of university operations. But if we're consciously prioritizing fiscal pragmatism over pedagogy, then I think we owe it to ourselves and our students to be honest about that. We just want to finish briefly by talking about whether there are alternatives to running exams, because it's all very well to criticize exams. If we want to wean ourselves off them, what are our options? And we suggest there are three quite practical ways of thinking about that challenge. We've described them as the 3 Rs, which are retaining and redesigning, reweighting, or replacing. If there's no way around replacing exams, if we have to retain them, the simplest thing we can do is to try and redesign them. Even post-COVID, when remote delivery of exams forced us to really rethink a little bit how we administer these exams, too many of our examinations still involve basic recall of facts, require one right answer, offer the students basically quite a low level of intellectual challenge. So shifting to short answer questions or context-rich multiple choice questions that require application is a much better option. Tests that are lower weighted, that have a formative function, that are scheduled through the semester, can also allow educators to kind of capitalize on test-enhanced learning. And there are lots of other exam formats that might engage students in higher order skills: open book, take-home, group work. One example of how an exam can be redesigned that I am very fond of, within the confines of having to be an exam, is to reimagine it as a 2-stage examination that includes an individual component and then a group component. So the students first complete the assessment individually, and then they work in groups or teams in a second stage. And I think this is really interesting because not only is there quite a lot of evidence to suggest that those exams lead to better immediate learning and retention, they have a formative component and they introduce a sort of collaborative element to this context, where in this second stage, students have to discuss with each other why they think something. They have to be able to explain themselves, and they have to arrive at some kind of consensus answer. So it has a really nice dialogic peer learning element to it.
So by reweighting exams, we can, of course, remove their high stakes consequences, which has a positive impact on student wellbeing, potentially. But importantly, we can also make room for more diverse forms of assessment, so that exams might just be one small task in a diversified assessment regime, rather than being the dominant or default mode as they often are currently. So one way in which exams can be reweighted is through policy. So to better understand the policy landscape in Australia, we looked at assessment weighting policies at all universities in Australia. Most Australian universities do have an assessment policy that limits the weighting of the exam, or in most cases it refers to any one piece of assessment, to no higher than a certain percentage of the total grade for a subject. That percentage varies from no higher than 40% to no higher than 70%. Notably, of the 40 universities in Australia, 14 universities don't have an assessment weighting policy. So we think that implementing an assessment weighting policy is a good idea, and that perhaps a weighting of no more than 50% might be a good starting point. So the obvious question that emerges, if we're going to replace exams, what do we replace them with? There are a very large number of options, and here we return to our earlier discussion about what we know about good assessment practice, relating to both diversity and timing. So once we remove a high-weighted assessment that was taking up the majority of the assessment load, there's clearly capacity for there to be multiple assessment tasks of lower weighting that can be varied in format. Some examples include peer assessments, self-assessments, assessment tasks that involve students in problem-based learning, authentic learning, assessments that are conducted in class and online. There are a lot of options to choose from, and the best choices will obviously depend on the discipline and the subject. but a move away from high-stakes exams opens up these possibilities. Many assessment regimes are also still heavily tilted in the direction of summative assessment. And as we've discussed, formative assessments are critical, especially to allow students to develop and improve their work over time and to learn from feedback. Of course, some forms of assessment are more resource intensive than others, but it doesn't automatically follow, I think, that replacing exams will create resourcing problems. There are options for scaling. Some of those involve technology, such as the various platforms that are used to support peer assessment, and those that support automated assessment and automated feedback and grading. So by using these kinds of platforms for some assessment tasks, this would then allow the use of some more labour-intensive options where feedback from academics is most valuable, such as oral presentations or Vivas, etc. So programmatic assessment offers the potential to diversify assessment methods across an entire program in a more intentional manner. And this might involve intaining some exams at certain points in the degree, but it would potentially allow more formative and low-weighted assessments at other points. That would be especially valuable in the foundational year when the emphasis is needed on assessments that foster aspects like cohort connections and experimental learning. So we'll conclude then with a few take-homes. We think there is a risk that the default to high-stakes exams may become even more prevalent if educators see it as the only way or the easiest way to deal with the Gen AI crisis. We've argued that high-stakes exams are not the right answer to deal with this issue. Secondly, while not denying the need for efficiency when implementing assessment at scale or the need for security, these concerns simply should not trump pedagogical concerns of good assessment practice. Thirdly, it's often difficult to create widespread institutional change or faculty level change in this area without policy to support it. So we see policy as a potentially powerful driver of change in assessment culture. So our hope is that this paper will stimulate debate and provide some impetus for assessment regimes that are more imaginative, more interesting, fairer, and ultimately more valid ways of assessing student learning. So we'll end the presentation here and open up for some discussion. We'd be very happy to take some questions and hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. Sarah, it just was so great to hear all of that linked to clear bits of evidence that people can follow up. They can go and read the paper, and it really is worth a read. I have questions, but I won't dominate from the chair because I think other people have questions too. I think we have one question up the front here. I'll just grab mine. Click it on. Thank you. And would you mind just saying who you are and what institution you're from as well, please? Thanks.
I'm from Edward Boypart is my name. I'm from Med Entry. It's an RTO. Now, by arguing against high-stakes examinations, you're basically arguing against ranking one person against another. My point is that the benefits of that are the customers. So by arguing against high-stakes assessment by extension, you're also arguing against a ranking of one company against another, one university against another, and so on. Ultimately, the benefits of ranking one against another as a company, individual, or organization or business is that the customer benefits. For example, if a ranking of Uber drivers were banned, who would lose out? It's the customers. Similarly, if a ranking of Airbnb by the customers are banned, who would lose out? The customers again. So my point is that by arguing against it, ultimately, the customers are going to lose out. I know you mentioned it's only important for pilots and medical entry exams, but it's important for everybody, whether it's a hairdresser or anyone. Customers are going to lose out. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Thank you. The first, and thank you for the question. What I would say is that I would take issue, first of all, with the idea that exams are the only way in which we can rank students. So there clearly is some need for summative assessment, some way of comparing students. But I think for all the reasons that we've outlined today, exams are actually a terrible way of doing that. And that relates to your second point around what is good for the customer. I'm not sure who you mean by the customer in this context. If the customer is the student, then these assessments are patently not good for the majority of customers. But if the customer is a prospective employer, this information is not particularly useful because for various reasons, the information the customer is getting about the students is not really telling them what they need to know about those students. It's presenting some aspect of those students, but not the full picture.
I might also just attend to this one a little bit as well and just say that there's a few concepts in there. So there's the concept of having high stakes assessment or not, which is a separate concept to having an exam or not, which is again a separate concept to ranking people. Assessment does not necessarily involve ranking people. And in the Australian higher ed context, at least, we are very strongly discouraged from assessment approaches that rank, where we're much more required to take a standards-based approach, where we compare what people do against some predetermined standards. So exams aren't necessarily always about plotting people on a curve. Now, do we have a question online?
We've got quite a few questions online. The most upvoted by a bit is Irina's question, who asks, what is your view on open book exams? In your experience, do open book exams assess a different set of skills, such as problem solving and application of knowledge, compared to high stakes closed book exams?
Yeah, there is quite a lot written about this. I mean, the focus of our review was specifically on closed book exams, but we did look at different formats, and it certainly seems that open book exams have the potential to offer an advantage against closed book exams. We looked at other formats as well. I guess part of our argument is that there are still, even with those exams, there are still limitations in terms of them being heavily weighted end of semester examinations, and in terms of their written format as well, that even with changes to assessment design, there are still limitations. But those changes certainly address some of the key themes that we've looked at, and certainly open book exams, I think, are better for discouraging rote learning, engaging students in some more in-depth, less surface level approaches to learning. Did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just follow that one a little. Did you observe anything around open bookedness versus closed book? Like, is it feasible to have this? Is it feasible to have a closed book exam that people don't just make open book? And what do we lose if someone makes a closed book exam open book by just like having their notes?
So, Phil, you're asking about the sort of a transition from closed book to open book?
I have I'll just say it. I think often people set restrictions on tasks that they have no way of enforcing, and it hurts the validity of the task because I tell you, now, don't you look at your notes while you do this exam, and then you look at your notes, and it's, how are we supposed to have any validity then?
Yeah. I'm in furious agreement. So I think that we're sort of kidding ourselves if we pretend that we have all of these restrictions and they tell us something if we can't enforce them. Yeah. So it's a powerful argument for saying, well, let's just be honest and say, effectively, they're all open book.
Okay, we have hands in the room. I think Margaret has a mic, so she...
Well, actually, all I'm going to do is ask you to turn off your screen.
Oh,
then we get to see you more.
All right, I think we can do that.
That would be great. And I'll ask a question while it's going, just to cover time.
Great.
Which is, I was wondering if you've given any thought to alternate conceptualizations of validity other than psychometric ones, given that they're not my favourite, to be honest.
Thanks, Margaret. And what a great question, because as we were preparing this presentation, we were discussing all of these themes and saying, in a way, you can conceptualize all of them as reasons for lack of validity. They're all ways of saying, well, if students, if we're trying to work out, for example, what students have learned or understand, but we're setting a test that they can cram and essentially giving us sort of surface recall answers, then it's not really a valid test of whether or not students have learned anything. And you can sort of apply that argument to almost every theme that we've discussed today. And so, yes, I think there is a way of conceptualizing all of these as alternate ways of thinking about validity, and they're all essentially kind of reasons why this particular type of instrument is something that doesn't have very high validity.
Thanks. Tom, do we have another?
Yeah, we've got quite a few online and a few in the room as well. So we'll go to one online first. We might go to Oriel, who asks, from another angle, we understand the issue of high stakes exams. We, presumably as academics, researchers. But how do we convince professions, for example, law, that exams do not prove what they think they actually might do?
So that's another great question, and something that we hear a lot is people saying, well, it's required by the accrediting body. Nothing we can do about it. We have to do an exam because that's what the accrediting body wants. I think if we say that, we're underestimating our power to influence accreditors. And I think that it's on us to be having those conversations with accreditors to explain why the insistence on something like an examination by an accrediting body isn't well founded. And so, I think I would prefer that instead of throwing our hands up and saying nothing we can do here, that's what the accreditor wants, we should be playing a more active role in having conversations with those accrediting bodies.
There also have been studies done where employers have been interviewed and asked, what is it that you most want from your graduates? And they tend to say things like communication skills, problem-solving skills, the kind of skills that probably aren't best tested in exams. So I think talking to them about what forms of assessment might most encourage the teaching and assessing of those skills would help as well.
Thanks. In the room, I think I saw Rebecca with her hand up before.
Thank you. I completely agree we need to be reducing high stakes exams, but I think an important consideration, and I'd be interested to know if you've looked at this, is the resourcing implications for the replacements or the redesign, because it's not just the design of that having educational designers or educators, but it's the holding of it, the moderation, the security, the grading and the feedback that's associated with that as well. So have you looked at all at sort of ranking in terms of resourcing different types of assessments?
It's not something we really looked at, is it? And it's a good question, and it's one that's come up a lot.
I think there are a couple of ways of thinking about it. One is sort of related to the idea of maybe taking a more programmatic view of assessment. So I absolutely get that if you're teaching a subject with 2,000 students in it and you're currently administering an exam, it is not easy to flip from that to an oral examination. But we're currently doing, at our institution, over 2,000 of these. So that's sucking up a lot of effort and time and energy. So if we rethink how much use we make of different types of assessment, there might be an opportunity to rethink how we resource them. So I guess the first thing I'd say is if we were more judicious about where we want to do these kind of assessments, where we really want to be sure about what the student understands, we might be able to allocate resources there. I'm also kind of optimistic, maybe a little bit excited in a naive way, about this as a sort of an area of potential in relation to generative AI. Sure, it isn't possible for one person to orally examine 2,000 students, but I don't know, some future whereby we have an AI that is asking the questions, not telling students the answers, starting conversations, following up on what students say with further conversations, recording that. I don't know, I think there's something interesting there potentially in terms of a future where assessments that seem very labor and effort intensive, like oral conversations, might actually be scalable.
Very minor follow-up question, and this isn't about the University of Melbourne, this is about a large metropolitan university in Melbourne. Just to be clear, at this fictitious place, does the cost for running the exam, the invigilators, the exam hall, all of that stuff, is that paid for by me wanting to set an exam as part of the cost of my subject? Or is that paid for centrally out of a magical pot of money?
I'm pretty sure it's paid for. It's my microphone. I'm pretty sure it's paid for centrally because the venues that are booked and the staff that staff those sort of exams are all centrally booked and organised.
Yeah, I'm aware of examples where the magical pot of money disappeared to fund exams centrally, and the number of exams just shrunk massively as well. I think the accounting around them is really interesting.
We've actually got a question on the accounting of them.
Great.
From Kath Ellis, who I think you mentioned this at the beginning of your talk, and this might relate to that. Kath says, did you find evidence to support the claim, that high stakes exams are resource effective relative to the cost of administering other assessment types?
Thanks, Kath. No, we haven't done any kind of analysis that brings that point to bear. It is a frequently mentioned reason for running examinations, but I think it would be great to actually sit down and try and sort of crank out the numbers and work out just how much cost is involved.
I think Dave has a question.
Yes, it also relates to resources. I like your paper because it puts together things on such a broad front in one place. But none of the things in the paper are new. I mean, we've known these for years and years and years. And really, it hasn't had a great effect on most universities. The thing that you've mentioned there is the resource constraint. It's cheaper to do exams rather than anything else. But my observation is, if you look around the world and you look at how well-resourced either a country is or an institution is, there's no relationship between that and the amount spent. So maybe the issue isn't to do with resources and the cost of doing alternatives. Maybe the constraint is something else. And I'd be interested in your speculations on what else is holding high-stakes examinations in place, rather than the fantasy that it's all to do with them being cheap.
Thanks, David. That's a great point. And I'm fascinated by the idea that maybe resourcing isn't coming into play here. I think, as is true for many other things, there's a big cultural element here. We have people teaching subjects who came through a system that had a particular form of assessment, or they're inheriting forms of assessment in subjects that others ran. They don't really have any reason to question that assessment regime because that's what they did and it worked for them. It also takes a lot of energy and effort to try and rethink things. So there is an inertia component to a lot of this as well, which is about, do I really have the energy to try and rethink, battle, argue for a completely different assessment regime? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's sort of some of what I think might be at play.
Yeah, it's a complex question. I think massification of the higher education has a lot to do with it, and we're looking at assessments that can be scalable. Certainly when we talk to people in our faculty who are teaching very large numbers of students, they say we have so few people to assess our students that the default has just meant that we've had to use exams. So it's not just the efficiencies in resourcing, it's thinking about marking and what kind of capacity exists at scale. And that's what we found when we were undertaking the curriculum project that we were working on, that we kept challenging academics to think of more creative forms of assessment, and they had great ideas, and they just felt there was an impediment to actually putting them in place, which often had to do with very large student numbers.
I'm really sorry to say that we are at the hour and we're going to have to wind up there. I just want to give a huge round of applause. Thank you again to Sarah and Raoul. What I really liked was the mix of evidence and pragmatism and real world experience of being people that use exams and have had to sort of struggle with this in universities. The recording of this will go out really soon as we can, which is usually like a week or two. And I just want to plug a couple of upcoming CRADLE events. Our CRADLE International Symposium, we have a public event on how could generative AI change work integrated learning. So that will be Wednesday, 9th of October at 2 p.m. You can find out about that in the same ways that you found out about this. So CRADLE blog is your source for that, or some of our emails we send you. And the next day, so that's Thursday, 10th of October, in partnership with ASIN, we have a webinar on professional identity development, work integrated learning, communities of practice. That one is at 11 a.m. on Thursday, 10th of October. Thank you so much for coming along to this CRADLE seminar. Let's keep the conversation going. Go have a cup of tea if you are online, and if you're face-to-face, let's have a cup of tea here. Thanks so much.